Welcome, everybody. And tonight we have Erin Corcoran uh, talking to us about what has architecture learned about integrating user needs post-pandemic. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Erin.
Perfect. Thanks, Joe. Well, I'm getting the screen share ready. Just a couple like housekeeping things. I will introduce myself in a sec. But if anybody's willing to turn their cameras on, I really hate speaking to an empty room. So if you're willing, I may toggle through just to see if other people are actually there. That's my human need. I would also say I've got a lot going on my screen right now, so I'm probably not going to have the chat up, but I think we've got a Q&A at the end, so apologies if I miss any questions as we go along. If it's really something you got to get off your chest, just feel free to come off mute and stop me, but just know I'm probably not watching that. So what have I got for you tonight? I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I've got a couple stories of work our firm is currently doing, some of the work my team here in Boston is doing. I've got a little bit of a recap of when I spoke with this group last time, which will probably only play with about 10 people on the call, but it's okay. You didn't have to see the prior talk. It's just helpful to set it in context. Talk a little bit about the work that I do with the team here at Gensler Boston. And then I just pulled a couple case stories. The case stories are not necessarily connected. It's just sort of interesting things that we've been up to in the last couple of years. I know workplace design, just judging by the poll coming in, is on a lot of people's minds, as well as like return to work. So talking a bit about that, but don't expect it to be a comprehensive narrative on return to work. It's more sort of what we've been working on. And then because this is a Boston group, we've also been doing some post-occupancy research on the hub on Causeway, which is the development on top of TD Garden. So bringing some of those findings today and then miscellaneous closing thoughts. So I will jump right into it. And again, if anybody wants to come on camera, let me know. So a little bit of a recap. Last time on BostonCHI, April 2020, this is a screenshot from that night. It was, I think we were using Mural. It was the first time we were trying to like interact and do networking online. And as a bit of a recap, so who am I? Why am I talking on a UX group? So my name is Erin Corcoran. I am a licensed architect, as in a building architect, not a software architect. And I am a strategy lead at Gensler. So Gensler is a global architecture and design firm, but we also have a strategy team. Sometimes it's called a consulting team, where we meet with users, study users to figure out what they need before we design the building. So it's part of the reason I started going to BostonCHI Talk is because I wanted to learn more about UX on the software design side to inform the work that we're doing on the architecture side. A couple other notes, things that get me real jazzed. The image on the bottom, you're like, why do we have a zoom into a dirty wall? It's kind of reflective on how I approach architecture and user-based design. I love evidence of humans on buildings. So this is a site tour that I actually did in Las Vegas, but don't worry, I was in the parking lot and the loading dock in October, and there were these marks all over the front of a relatively new building. And I'm like, oh, what's this? Is it like graffiti that you're wiping off or that sort of thing? And we were interviewing the facilities team. And they're like, no, it's just we're a concert venue. And when people line up for concerts and there's no benches or places to sit, they lean on the walls with their phone. I think all of us have done this pose. It's the 1 foot up with the phone in your hand. And all of these marks all the way around the building into the parking lot are just single foot stands over time for people attending concerts. So the fact that that's one of my favorite user stories says a lot about me and sort of the tone of this talk. It's going to be a little bit nerdy, but I just love seeing like, oh, okay, we could have designed that better. We're working on a second location. Could we add more protection to that area or give people a place to sit or where they're not going to damage the surroundings? So the work I do is mainly interviewing users, measuring users, doing surveys. I'll talk through a little bit about that to inform design. So a little bit of background on strategy and design as well. So this is, I'd still say it's pretty emerging in architecture. I went through almost 10 years of my architectural career without even knowing this existed, that we could talk to users before we designed the building. And I would say in the last 2 years, it's definitely become a lot more critical. There's been a lot of designs where it's just, well, what do we do? Everything's changing all the time. Could we do a study? Could we talk to people? And the conversation has become a lot more critical for the type of work we do to do informed designs in a realm of uncertainty. I'll talk about these images a little bit later. This part's a recap from the prior talk, but just since this is predominantly a UX audience, sort of what are the terms that we use? What does UX actually translate into buildings? I'd say most of our work is sort of 4 key areas. It's high-level studies, so like we're not actively building a building, we might be master planning or looking at different sites, trying to determine what to put there. The bread and butter is program development. So trying to figure out what the program is for the building, like what are the pieces that need to go into it, either by observing existing spaces or talking to users that will move into the new one. That's our most common service. My favorite is the quick hit or the gut check, where we're already on a project that's moving ahead and it's like, oh, what about this? Could we actually ask or study or do a little bit of research to inform that design? I like those because they're usually weird questions. It's not necessarily a big formal thing. You're just coming in, trying something out, and then seeing how it works out with the design. And then post-occupancy, you would think this type of work, maybe we do a lot of studies after the building's open. I would say the difference between our projects and maybe a software rollout that's doing A/B testing or testing live, buildings take a long time to make. So sometimes a project will take between 6 months to 6 years. And sometimes after 6 years of building a building, I don't know if anybody's done a renovation on their house, the last thing you want to do is come back and be like, how did this go? What should we improve? So often we don't do postdoc just because the incentives aren't quite there for us to be paid for that type of service. But Gensler is a large firm. So one of the case stories I have today, if we have a really big successful project and we want to take those learnings and roll them into the next one, sometimes we have an internal grant program. I'm saying research with a lowercase r. It's not university level research, but we do sort of make the time to go back and study the projects. And we call it research, but I know in this crowd, I've got to watch my language on that one. It's not necessarily statistically significant. What are the tools we use? I'm just going to brush over this real quick. If you have the BostonCHI YouTube channel, my last talk was mainly just diving into case stories on these tools, but we try to balance quantitative and qualitative. So we'll do reviewing existing data, whether that's like badge swipes for employees coming in. We'll do surveys, activity analysis. What are people doing? Sensors, I will talk about later because that is an emerging something that we're doing a lot more. And then qualitative, like just go to the buildings, go to similar projects, talk to people. Stakeholder interviews is something that are really important, but really simple. Focus groups, and then sort of developing personas, which is another one I'll lean into a little bit tonight. Talking about what that looks like, again, I'll go through pretty quick because this is more of just setting the context. User interviews, usually it's in person in the space, talking to the groups about what they need. In the last 2 years, that's been a lot over Zoom, which has been a pretty meta conversation. Architects talking to people about spaces while they're in their own homes, talking to other people that haven't been to spaces in a while, but we've managed. Co-creation with users, that may be in person, sort of having people vote and discuss a topic, or sometimes we'll even do like Lego master plan exercises in person, or on the top right, you're seeing a digital equivalent where we might have users actually come into a row board and sort of vote and move pieces around to make it interactive. And then this one I want to hit because this is the slide I had 2 years ago, which was basically an emerging technology where we're putting sensors into workplaces in particular that are linked to like the space booking software. So this is a product. Again, this slide's from 2 years ago, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about sensors. But in general, it's a furniture company that will put like a sensor above the door, maybe at a desk, so that when you book the meeting room, if no one shows up in 5 minutes, if the door sensor wasn't triggered, they could release it back. So you're kind of having that live feed to meet that pain point of like booking rooms and no one coming. And I would say that was very much in the emerging category. And this is now very much in the let's put in more sensors because we don't know how people are going to use space as they come back. How we've adapted, so a little bit on the meta level. So we were very in-person heavy, 5 days a week. Let's do everything in person with big printed plans and post-it notes and sketching and that sort of thing. So how has architecture adapted? It has been an odd couple years. This was one of my last slides of the talk last time that is so very 2020. That BostonCHI video, like whenever I send people the link to that talk, I'm like, it's very of its time. It was 3 weeks into the pandemic. It was very much of like, everything's changing, but don't worry, it'll be over soon. So like this was one of my wrap up slides as far as like, there's this elephant in the room of what's gonna happen, but I would also say like, you know, it hasn't, we've adapted, we've figured out different ways to work, but the facepalm that somebody captured of me, I use that all the time. It's been an odd couple years. This was what the conversation was about in April 2020. It was like, how do we keep people 6 feet apart? How do we find out like who's at the kitchen table, who needs help, that sort of thing. And a lot of conversations around cleaning and microbial products and that sort of thing. But again, this is very representative of the reactionary, we've got a virus, let's solve it quick attitude that we had in the early 2020s. The one thing that I did mention last time that has continued is we do a lot of workplace research. So we survey people, not just clients, all across the globe, sort of asking how they want to work in the future. We used to do this on a two-year cycle, going back to 2008. This is probably the most capital R research that Gensler does. And in the last 2 years, we've adapted this to a 4-month cycle. So every 4 months, we're going to a panel of employees across the US and in the EU and India to find out sort of how often do people want to come in, what are the trends. What I've got on the screen is from, I think, fall 2020. So it is showing more of that, I want to come into the office 3 days a week. And I would say the main difference now is it's just shifted across the 3 days. Most people are trending at the wanting to come in 2 days a week right now, but in another 4 months, it may be different again. But we are checking in more often, and sort of where we have the studies that we've run over time that we can compare data, we've just upped the cycle. Okay, so let's get into the new content. So that was more of the recap. That's what we talked about last time. This is the first case story. And I think for a lot of people, just based on the poll at the beginning, this is where a lot of the interest is. So I'll sort of dig into these. So how has workplace design and return to work become entwined? So the conversation around returning to work, making people feel comfortable dealing with that change, as well as what do you design, what do you do? And that conversation, I will say Gensler does a lot of workplace design. We do a lot of different types of building, but we do a lot of workplace. It's probably about a third to half of all of Gensler's projects around the globe. So a lot of these conversations around return to work have been happening continuously. So if you still have that tab open on your phone, the link is at the top. It's pollev.com/Gensler. I just want to do a quick test poll, if you'll bear with me, to find out how many days a week people would like to come in. And don't throw the results just because I said it's usually in the like 2-ish days a week. Never. Nice. I'm just curious the crowd we've got today, because I can frame my narrative accordingly to not get people upset. Almost every day. Okay. Usually we get a pretty good bell curve around with the peak around the few days a week. Okay, I'll leave that going for 1 more minute, but I think we've already achieved the bell curve that I was looking for. Or there's 2 sides about this debate that we're seeing on the screen. Never, rarely, inside presence. Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. So it's been an interesting couple of years to be working in workplace design and having conversations about workplace design as a workplace creature. Architects are workplace creatures designing workplaces for other types of creatures, whether they're working in software or labs or science or that sort of thing. So we are engaging with the popular return to work topic in a very, I'd say it feels a lot closer than it used to be in the past. So you might be working on a workplace project for someone else and it felt like, oh, we've got a degree of separation. Whereas now I find like I send around the return to work memes to my friends while simultaneously having conversations with clients about return to work. The TikTok on the top right, it does have a soundtrack of like a woman sort of sobbing as she puts her track pants and sandals away and pulls out the work shoes and the blazer. We are definitely doing a lot of change management and change support projects, which I'm going to talk about, and getting feedback from employees that like, well, if this is the culture, why do I have to come in? And also like debates on, again, both sides to avoid using that phrasing, but a number of people that are really interested in being digital nomads, and then others that are really finding that working alone in their houses is not really benefiting their connection to organizations or their mental health. So that's the spectrum we've been working in. I'm going to tell you sort of how we're approaching it. Again, we are an architecture firm, so space tends to be how the conversation gets started. But I would say 2 years ago, we probably would have said space, and then we might hit on these other things. I'd say all of the projects we have on the boards now, we're talking about all of it. And the stakeholders we're working with are not necessarily just facilities teams that are responsible for the building. We're working with teams that might have people from HR, it might have people from the technology or tech groups, how to set up meeting rooms, how to make sure that when everybody comes in, all of their tech works. And then we're not writing policy, but the decisions and spatial choices that we're making are informed by sort of what firms and companies are doing on any given day, whether they're coming back soon, whether they're coming back later. So I'd say personally, this has made the work really more interesting. Because it's got this intersectional piece to it where they might be trying to just improve the culture or retention or getting people to come in and connect, bringing new hires together. And what are the spaces and pilots we can support that? How is tech integrated? But I think for me anyway, it's more interesting to think about the people as well as the space. Again, I'm biased because I've shifted to more people-based architecture, and then technology, like you can design a beautiful, beautiful office, but if people come into a meeting room and the Zoom connection isn't working, it's not a successful space. So we've had to really, that's not our expertise, but we've had to bring in partners so that we're making sure we're covering all these edges. I think the other part is that strategy. This is more kind of our internal approach. This is sort of the wider team. Strategy and design, we're always connected for our teams, but change management and how you support change and roll out these new spaces or pilot spaces has also become much more a part of the discussion. Change management means a lot of different things in different contexts. If you look it up on HBR, you're going to get one answer. If you ask us, I'd say most of our work, it's basically during strategy phases, we'll talk to people, we'll do surveys, we'll write reports and use it to inform the design. What we do in change management is use those same tools, but it's more focused at the return to work. So we'll talk to people, we'll survey, we'll inform people about the design, like we might ghost write a town hall. And then when people actually come back, we'll study how they're using the space, what the pain points are, and sort of keep that loop going, as opposed to what we did in the past, which was more sort of study at the beginning, do the design, maybe move them in, and then leave. Whereas return to work, it's much more try a design, check in with people on how the change went and what's working with what's not, to then inform future cycles. So some of that has shifted, some of it is splitting hairs a bit, but I'd say things have become more complicated, but more interesting and sort of comprehensive at the same time. Change management, I did high level on the last slide because I guess I forgot this one, but in general, our approach to change management is much more focused on that feedback loop. So asking people sort of what they need, reporting out, or helping to adjust the spatial design. I think the one part that shows up only in change management, but not so much in pre-design, is we'll also work with employee stakeholder groups. So we might have a group of like representatives from all the departments that we check in with every month as far as what's on your mind this month, what do you need, how is the space working, which is kind of a continuous focus group that we don't really have on the pure strategy, which is more that sort of peer-to-peer networking. So we're checking in, we're finding out what the various teams are experiencing, and then they can also report out like, oh, we're trying a new pilot space, or we're coming back to the office next month, as more of like an internal loop, as opposed to more like interviewing leaders at the beginning or just doing one focus group. It's more of a cycle. And I'd say some of these pictures are from change management projects we did pre-pandemic. Definitely most of the work we're doing is currently online, but we do have a few projects that are starting to return back to work, where we're starting that sort of feedback cycle of sort of how is the new space working for you? Is there anything that needs to be fixed on like any of these categories? Just wanted to show this as an aside. This is kind of our typical, well, if anything's typical anymore, but as we're looking at hybrid work projects, this is kind of how our approach has adapted. It's a lot of what I was mentioning verbally, but it's a nice little, like at the beginning, we might do visioning and a survey, do focus groups, maybe meet with each department about what they need for the space. Then we'll start looking and working with their HR teams on their hybrid policies and sort of like, what are you trying to achieve? How can the space support that? And we might actually at that point, now that we have a little bit of a design started based on how they work, go back and actually connect with people about, oh, how many days are you planning on coming in? Do you need your own space? What are the reasons for that? That sort of thing. And then I'd say a lot of our projects are doing pilots or labs right now. So instead of committing to renovate an entire building based on partial knowledge, a lot of our clients are taking parts of floors or areas and building pilots or labs so that they can try out new space types, get the feedback from employees, and sort of celebrate that return to work a little bit as far as like, this is where we're thinking of going. Is this the right direction, as opposed to full renovations? And that's where that piloting and change management kind of connect together, where you're like communicating out about the pilot, getting feedback back as people are using it, and then reporting back like, hey, we took your feedback. This is what the next section of desks is going to look like. And then we'll pilot it and do it in bits and pieces. Because of the level of uncertainty, it's a lot less of like, let's just study it and build it, and more of a like, let's study it, talk again, try it, check in, talk again, keep going, and sort of move a little bit at a time. I'd say the only part that doesn't quite align with that testing is like a lot of meeting room upgrades are happening, and that's just happening. It's just like you're putting in the cameras, you're putting in the hybrid technology, and those are just proceeding. You might upgrade all of the meeting rooms at once. Future of work. There's a couple of my colleagues from Gensler on here. I'm going to narrow it down to like 2 to 3 slides. We could do an entire thing on future of work trends, but I think the big shift that we're seeing is like, this is a pretty typical office configuration pre-pandemic for a lot of different organizations. So you have a lot of individual spaces. You might have cubicles, maybe some private offices around the perimeter. You'll have some desks with a pretty large footprint, and you might have like a centralized, maybe a little kitchen area, some big meeting rooms, a reception zone, and that's pretty much your spectrum of spaces. What we're seeing now, and again, this is a trend, this isn't necessarily like what we would design for every client. We do customize based on how people work. But at a high level, like a trend-based level, we are seeing large increases and interest in more community spaces and more support for collaboration. So seeing the office as a space that needs to be a little bit more flexible as teams get bigger or smaller, or if they want to come in more often one week versus the other. And then really having these multi-use community spaces where people can connect informally or do heads down focused work that have a lot more sort of movable pieces, as opposed to the cubicles, which I don't know if anybody's tried to move one of those things, but they're basically bolted to the floor with all the IT cables and everything connected. So with good Wi-Fi, power charging, and more flexible arrangements, it just gives options. So if one organization is saying, well, the office is just for collaborating and celebration, that's all we're going to use it for, they've got options to host like large group meetings and scrum sessions or bring teams together. But if an office is also like, we're just going to give people choice, if they want to come into focus, they can too. We tend to zone sort of like quieter areas with a little more sort of enclosed rooms for video calls and that sort of thing, but still increasing that community space, because you may have those people that are only coming in once a month and maybe they don't need sort of a full individual desk, and they'd prefer to like sort of meet a bunch of people the day they come in and have a bit more of that social and collaboration time. as I said, we adapt this to all of our clients, and we do, it isn't one size fit all, but this is more the trend of sort of the emphasis is shifting to more community and collaboration spaces as people are articulating that maybe they concentrate better at home. And a lot of organizations are allowing home as an option as you're choosing your schedule. Other things that we're doing that we definitely didn't do before. So one of the pain points is, and a very common question is like, oh, we're doing hybrid, but how do I know? What if everybody comes in at once? What if everybody comes in on Tuesday and the space is empty on Thursday and Friday? What, like all of these scenarios that people can think of. And we don't have the answers to it. We haven't seen hybrid working for 30 or 40 years to know, like, are there days that everybody prefers or trends that we can go to? So what you're seeing on the screen, she wasn't able to join tonight, but one of my colleagues actually developed just a little calculator tool based on the Monte Carlo simulation. So it's basically probability. Like if you have these variables and you run it out multiple times, what are the odds that something will land? It's card games, but land on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So we do department interviews, or we use employee survey data or leadership input. Like I want my team to come in 4 days a week. HR data for number of employees. And then the parameters that we adjust is how many days is the team saying they want to come in, how many people are in that category, and are there any preferences for day of the week? Like, is it a sales team that always meets on Monday all together? So they would have a higher preference for Monday versus other days. And basically we run that scenario, I think it's 3,000 or so times, just to see sort of which days with those parameters, all things being equal, different, same odds every time, what is the probability and where do our peak loads stand? And it's, again, it was just an open source code that we've adapted to this specific use with these variables. So we'll put in like all of the different departments, and we'll just run scenarios to be like, well, how many people are coming in on a peak day? And for a lot of our projects right now, we'll actually run multiple different options. So this one on the bottom, just for example, the leadership-led hybrid model is basically the leader saying, I want my people in more often. So we up the variables saying, okay, people are coming in 3 to 4 days a week as opposed to 1 to 2. How many primary seats, so how many assigned seats do you need versus how many sort of overflow or touchdown or that sort of thing would you need? The one on the right was based on employee survey data. So the same question you asked earlier, I think we had a little more nuance to it, like specifically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that it can feed better into our calculator. But this one is based on sort of what employees said, divided by department averages. It's not necessarily every employee got to fill this out individually, but we have the department data from the employee survey, and running the option of like, how many seats do we need so that the space won't feel empty all the time, but at the same time, if everyone came in at once, do we have enough overflow in the cafe or touchdown seating to accommodate the full population? And that's sort of what we're doing for a lot of projects. We spend a lot of time sort of interviewing, doing surveys, trying to trying to figure out where people are right now, and then look at different possibilities. And usually our designs are kind of ending up somewhere in the middle, or maybe our client wants to play it a little more conservative and they go for the more space options, but it's basically trying to make more informed decisions in a world where the variables are changing a lot. I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing after we design it to study it afterwards. Other things that we're doing, I won't spend too much time on this, but it's mainly trends. Like we are doing a lot of employee surveying. I think the interesting part in comparison to part 1 of this talk is I had an anecdote in the original deck as far as like people hate surveys. So pre-pandemic, we were fighting tooth and nail to be like, can we just please have a survey? It's a very comprehensive set of data. It helps us a lot. And people are like, no more surveys. My people don't want surveys. During the pandemic, people love filling out surveys. Our response rates have gone off the charts. Like we used to fight for a 30% response rate. I'm seeing Jared laughing because you remember we had to fight for 30% response rates pre-pandemic, and now we're getting 50, 60, 70% in the first week of a survey going out. So people are interested in return to work and they want to respond to express their opinions. So it has become a really good data point for us. What you're seeing on the screen is actually, I think it's about 6 months old, but it's from my own office. We are doing this for ourselves as well. It's like a really meta time. Like as an architecture team, do I want to have hybrid? And the answer is resoundingly yes. But what are we worried about? Like, we're not used to communicating like, oh, I'll be in on Tuesday versus Thursday. We're used to behaving like, oh, I'll just stop by your desk. Focus time is a concern even outside of architecture. It's a concern across, as far as like, if I have to come in or I'm doing hybrid, I'm not gonna be able to focus, or there's going to be everybody on calls. Flexibility, and then also like the office space isn't ready for this. And I'd say a lot of these themes are across the board, but everybody's looking for flexibility, but people are also worried about inclusion and disconnects and sort of hybrid not working. Other things that we're hearing, again, we do focus groups as well. We went with Miro. I know there's a lot of different tech out there, whiteboarding tech, but we have adapted a lot of our sort of focus groups where we'll maybe show survey data, ask people sort of how they work to get at what spaces they need. And a lot of our workshops have been sort of digital over the last couple of years. This is just an example of one of them. But also, I'd say the other thing that's increased a lot is in our past work, we might do like one leadership session at the beginning and then talk to some employees while we're designing workplace. I think we're doing a lot more leadership sessions. So leaders want to communicate to their employees. They want to tell them what's going on, but it is uncertain. So we're finding we're doing a lot of exercises with leaders to try to get their ducks in a row so that we can communicate out this is what we know versus not. And I would say if anybody's trying to have a conversation in an uncertain world, this is actually kind of a nice framework that's worked for us, as far as like, imagine the worst possible situation, the hybrid work dystopia. Like, what is your worst imagining, your fears for how this could fail? And then talk about what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes it's easier for people to articulate sort of what they don't want than it is to start the conversation with like, well, what do you want it to be? And we find like this sort of half and half just makes the conversation a little bit easier. We do usually end up with a lot in that this is what we want to aspire to, but it's been a nice framework of like, a lot of this is uncertain and people are, a little anxious about that. So can we start by just getting that part off the chest and then figuring out sort of where we want to go? This is another sample of sort of leader discussions. It's a little hard to read, but in general, the tricky problem on this one was, as an organization, they decided to do 3-2, so 3 days in, 2 days out. But then they also wanted to do something called anchor days. It was their term, but basically, are there days where we're all in person? But there was a lot of debate. This was a global headquarters, and they probably had like a 20 different departments, 20-person leadership team. And it was like, well, what does an anchor day actually mean at our office before we tell our employees, like, it's okay, we're going to do anchor days? Let's align on what that means. So we ended up building a conversation around like, is an anchor day just the team coming together for 2 hours? Is it a whole day? Is it an individual saying, I'm always coming in on Tuesday? This one is company-wide, it's a little covered up. This is multi-teams deciding on the same day. And then this is like the entire building. And having a conversation around like, what does this look like? This is reflective of how back and forth the conversation was. But I would say on the sort of, when we were summing it up, they ended up agreeing on like, we're going to decide by team. We'll talk to the teams we work with a lot and see if we can align that. But they just felt like that scale of like, let's get our team in and agree maybe Tuesdays we're going to be in, as opposed to kind of having a free for all on this end, or having that like, oh no, what if there's not enough seats for everyone if we force everyone to come in on a certain day? So again, like a lot of the conversations we're having, it's the same tools we used before, like talking to leaders. It's just sometimes we're talking about policy to get to space. Sometimes we're working directly with HR teams to sort of resolve like, what does this mean at this site if there's like a global policy? And I'd say the conversations have just become, that's that tangle of like policy, culture, space, technology, and talking about it all at once. Other things that we're doing, personas, we're doing a lot of personas. So talking to people, trying to identify common paths, common behaviors, different types of employees as a way to help us plan for space. Because you can have a policy across the board for everybody and see how it goes, or you can recognize that there's probably different types of employees that may be a mix of them within each department, but trying to understand that variable. This is a life science company. They have a mix of labs and offices, and the personas, which are highly customized to every client. There's patterns. There's definitely patterns of people that are like a little bit more remote. That might be a sales team for one company, and more of like someone that's working on global teams for this one. Roaming tends to be kind of that half and half. Like they're sort of half in the office, they're half at home. They do need to connect in person for some things. They need to be home. That's probably your pure hybrid. But life science companies as well have a lot of people that are really connected to the physical lab, and you can't necessarily run experiments from home. And a lot of the companies we work with, especially in the Cambridge area that have labs, they've had employees that have been coming in the whole time. So when you have a conversation about return to work with a lab-based company, a lot of them are like, well, we've been here, it's not return for us. But you might have 20% of the population that has been working from home. So as we use the personas to talk about how they work, it helps us get to how many seats, but it also shows like, you know what, you might provision the workstations for the research team that's there every day differently than you might for someone that needs to like do one-on-ones with people throughout the day. This is just another example of like for a different client, what this looks like, and other frameworks that we've been using. We tend to adapt these frameworks to the conversations that come from our clients. There are patterns, more in office, more remote, but sometimes more of the conversation is sort of that aspiration versus what's stressing me out versus something that's more tactical as far as like, these are the tools I need to access. And that's what I mean as far as the personas look really different depending on what we're designing. Yes, it's workplace a lot of the times, and a lot of these examples are workplace, but it really depends sort of what their policies are, what they're hoping to do, and where their people are at. One other thing I want to mention is sort of starting strong, and this one is more in the change management portion. Something that's become more important as you're having these discussions is like, well, what happens the day you open? And can the architecture team or our strategy team help with that? So we're not necessarily buying the cake and the balloons and the free tote bags that people are having, but we may take the strategy questions that we're still curious about and populate a couple of the whiteboards so people fill it out when they arrive. Our team, when I talk about integrating with technology, one of the pain points that came up from one of our change management projects is there's so many instruction manuals for all this tech and I don't know where to find it. And we're like, well, we could build you like a one-stop shop. We didn't write any of the content, but we organized and set up a little website so people could find things, because we were hearing from the users like, oh, I have to book a desk, I have to log into a meeting room, I have to learn how to use Miro. How do I find that all in one place? So when I say it's gotten real weird, we might be building an instruction manual for technology software on the same project that we're doing maps for when people come in. It's more interesting. I find it more interesting, but if you'd asked me 2 years ago if we would be designing a tech training hub for a client, I would have been like, that doesn't sound related to space at all, but it's related to that sort of human discussion. And the celebrations, like as we get closer to it, we check in with that employee group, like what did you miss about pre-pandemic? How did you used to celebrate? And then we'll pass that information on to the HR or site teams to start planning those sessions. And I would say we had a client do their first week return to work last week in Boston, and our team was there in the client's uniforms with little cards of like common questions and QR codes so people could access the different resources. So it's more interesting. It's very focused on the people, but sometimes it's a little more step aside from space. And then sensors and booking apps. So I would say this is the other sort of big one that we're seeing. So we can run those scenarios in the Monte Carlo calculator. We can talk to people. Their answers will change over time and depending on when we checked in. But how do we know what they're going to do when they start coming back? And that sensor slide from before was very much like, oh, let's try these things. But a lot of the new sort of best in class offices that we're doing are using occupancy sensors for workstations. Meeting rooms tend to be pretty common. Sometimes it'll also include sort of who checked in every day, like employee badges. It won't say exactly who, it's just tracking the trends, how many people are coming to the building, which spaces are more popular. But it's also often linked to the meeting room booking software so that people can sort of have live feeds as far as which desks are available, which meeting rooms are available. And it is becoming a baseline. It's not a sensor with a camera on it. They tend to just be motion sensors, but it might be mounted under the desk and linked to the desk booking software so that the minute someone packs up, it'll show as available. And I would say not all apps are created equal, and we're not, Gensler is not a designer of desk booking apps, but I'd say the ones that tend to go down smoother with return to work conversations are the ones that address the pain point of how do I know who's in? So a few of the products out there actually have like find your friends or add certain people, and as they book desks, you can see, oh, so-and-so, my work bestie is going to be in there next Tuesday, maybe I'll meet up with them. Or when they check in, they can see sort of who on their friends list is in. I would say if anybody's working on those apps, that one, as you're trying to like instruct people about return to work, one of their main questions is like, well, how do I know where my team is or where people booked or where they're sitting? That feature definitely lowers the temperature in that conversation. And then also a number of organizations are doing sort of department areas. So like you'll have first choice of desk in an area where your department always books, so that at least you'll have that serendipitous. It's not like you're booking across 8 floors and you'll never know where anyone is. But I would say almost all of the new build projects and some of the projects that are piloting are looking at software supports like this. It also helps with contact tracing, seeing who's in every day. There is that sort of side feature as far as, you know, if you have to shut down, you can see who was booked in that area and sort of notify through HR if you need to. And then the last one that I have in this return to work section is, you know, sometimes you don't have to have everything figured out. You know, people do genuinely want to see each other. And I would say some of the buildings where we're more talking to people, doing light touch renovations. Sometimes it's as simple as like, is there something new that wasn't there before? Sparkling water machines are a really good engagement point. We've used them on a few projects where you can vote for what flavors. This is literally, again, Gensler folks on the call, Boston office finally got a sparkling water machine, and this is me hugging it and sending it to my managing director. I'm like, we did it. But yeah, sometimes it doesn't have to be rocket science. Sometimes you can just sort of celebrate coming back. And then I think the other one that our office did, again, pretty low tech, but we did sort of name tags for everyone when we were starting to ramp up the office, and they had different colors if you'd worked there pre-pandemic versus joined during the pandemic. So our office is 50% new hires over the last 2 years, but we also haven't seen each other for 2 years. So these name tags both met the, oh, I'm a new hire and I don't know anybody pain point, as well as the, oh God, what if I ask somebody if they're a new hire and we've actually talked multiple times 2 years ago pain point. So it was just a really effective like way to celebrate and sort of reconnect with people. That was low tech, that didn't need 5 focus groups. So I'll take a breath there. I'm going to switch topics entirely to a completely different case story. Stop talking about return to work. This one will be a little bit shorter, but happy to Q&A on both of them. So apologies for anybody in the call who's not from Boston. But if you are from Boston, you probably know the Zakin Bridge, TD Garden is here, and the hub on Causeway, which I'm realizing with discussions with Joe yesterday, nobody calls it the hub on Causeway except for us and the developer. To people in Boston, it's just TD Garden, like this is the development on top, but the hub on Causeway as a development is the new Verizon Tower, office space underneath. There's a brand new entrance and fan experience. There's also a grocery store, a food hall, a hotel tower, and some residential on the site. And this is a Gensler development. When I said we do post-occupancy sometimes, this is the scale of project where a post-occupancy study is something we do internally. And I was involved with a team on this project, and I just wanted to bring some of those findings in to this group, because when we're talking about like user experience of buildings, it's where we actually get to go back and be like, well, we designed this, what did we get right? So this image is not from the hub. This is a trick, but how do you know a space has a wow factor? Like that's a really fuzzy thing to try to measure in a space. And this was the same building actually that had the footmarks outside in it. And I was doing site observations. We were sort of seeing how people use the space throughout the day. And what kept happening, it had sort of like a tunnel entrance and then it opened up into this land. And everyone's first response was, "Oh, wow, phone." Like, I have to take a picture of this. And as a result, they were bottlenecking up at the door. So we're designing a second location. It's a concert venue with some other sort of odd art pieces and bars, and I'm not going to get into it. But in general, like, what are those pieces of human behavior that you see in users using space that show like a measure of success? And this one, everyone was wowed. It's just now we got to figure out like a wider door or queuing area for photos or something, because literally what kept happening is like the doors would slide open, people would whip out their phones, and then the next person would come in and be like, oh, sorry, and then whip out their phones, and you would get this pile of people at the entrance. And so again, I'm a big fan of sort of spaces that feel right, and like how do you figure out what that DNA is? And this research project, part of the reason I like it is because we tried to have that conversation. It was over the course of 2 really strange years, but we tried to take 2 large-scale developments that Gensler worked on, one that had a lot of similarities, but some differences. TD Garden, I just talked about. Fifth and Broadway in Nashville. Again, it's also across from a hockey arena. It has a similar mix of programs. It has an office tower, hotel, food venues, concert venues, and then also a sports venue adjacent. So it's like, okay, it's really hard to get 2 perfect examples with a lot of similarities. But again, people were saying the developments were successful and felt like good places, but what were the factors? So we ended up talking to a lot of user groups. We did site observations. We tried to scan social media, sort of what are people photographing, what are people connecting to, but I would say we don't really have the technology for that. So it's pretty anecdotal on that one. But these are sort of what aligned across user groups. So when I say user groups of a large scale development, you have the developer, maybe the architecture teams, you have the tenants that choose to rent space, you have community members, you also might have tourists and visitors. So we knew that we had a lot of conversations with those user groups, and then we had a number of factors, which I'll show you, that they identified as like, oh, this works really well. And then we tried to sort of like diagram, like for future projects, how do we show like how that mix worked or not? So this is the hub on Causeway. This is us trying to explore sort of like what are the pieces that make up a neighborhood and what might be missing, and sort of who does it serve? So what you've got around the ring is kind of just an ingredient list of what you might put in a large scale development, like what pieces of a city almost. And what the hub had are the ones that are in black. And then the thing that we noticed about the hub, and we heard this from multiple people, is like a lot of these amenities were actually open both to the public and to the tenants. So the office, the office creatures in the tower get all of these pieces, but except for one like in-house gym, the public also got full access to all of these pieces. So that was one of the things we're like, is it more active? Does it feel more inviting because you have outsiders visiting it at different times of day and it's more active? Like if you only rely on the office tenants to activate the space, they're not going to be around evenings and weekends, and it might be a bit of a dead zone. Again, these are all theories that we're hoping to apply to new projects. Another key aspect that we noticed is in both the developments, when we looked at the program mix, it wasn't just that it had the right pieces, it also had pieces that lit up at different times of day. So if you go to the Hub on Causeway development at 8 o'clock in the morning on a weekday, there's the coffee shop open, there's the commuter rail station, there's activity, even though it's a little quieter. You go in the afternoon, it's more grocery stores, maybe families, maybe people going to the sports shops. And in the evening, it is its peak load. It does have bars, restaurants, and a sports venue, but you sort of have that foot traffic all day, every day, and throughout the week. What we found also at Fifth and Broadway, it kind of had that light up, like, can you hit the morning or the afternoon? Can you hit the weekdays versus the weekend, and try to keep it an active place? Another one that came up in the interviews is it just felt really approachable. So we're like, okay, well, how could we maybe measure approachable and set some benchmarks for future projects? So we looked a little bit at like the site edge. Is it glass? Can you see through it? Can you walk through it? So the purple is sort of like you can walk through it. Sorry, the pink. The purple is kind of blank wall. It's a bit of their loading dock. Yellow you can see through. And then unwelcoming is what we sort of had in orange. Like they had a number of areas, but most of the street front is that fully open. You can always move through. So can we have questions that we asked on the next projects as far as like, can we give back more public space? Can we make it more, even if you can see through it, it feels more welcoming than a brick wall? But I would say for the hub, the conversation around permeability, we also looked at multiple paths. And I think, and again, these are theories, these are partially opinion of our teams, but if you ever get a chance to walk around the hub development, if you are just trying to get into the grocery store that's below it to pick up some milk, you can sneak your way around the game day entrance and just sort of work your way directly into it. If you're just trying to get to your commuter rail to get home, you can run through it or walk around the whole thing on game day. You've got multiple options to work your way through. And what was nice about the hub as well is you had cut throughs where you're actually cutting through like an active food hall, but it doesn't feel weird like you're walking through a restaurant. So a lot of different options depending on like how extroverted you want the experience to be. If you're going to a game day, you might go right up the main stairs and get that whole sort of grand entrance. But again, like there's a grocery store that's underneath this whole development. If you just want to pick up milk, there are ways you can sneak down there and avoid the crowds. I don't have the Nashville project on this, but the Nashville project was more arranged as like a retail street. So like everything was linked to one street, and the street edge around it was really kind of dead as a result. Like it was really active, it had things to go to, but it bottlenecked everyone through one kind of like mall experience path, as opposed to this one that sort of felt more like, like a neighborhood you could sort of wander through. Outdoor space, I would say this is table stakes. So this is something that is part of all developments now. COVID, it was already happening pre-COVID. Having access to outdoor space has only been emphasized during COVID. And both of these developments have a lot of sort of vertical outdoor spaces. But I think the interesting part, like these are just measuring the area, like what percentage of the building. We tried different ways of measuring because we're trying to benchmark for future work. But where it really gets interesting, again, my opinion, is when you start looking at public versus private and programmed outdoor space. So you can have a park that's just grass, or you can have a park that has a dog park section and a pool or a community space or a playground, like something that's much more programmed. And what we saw at both sites is, again, that overlap of public and private so that you have spaces that feel more active at all times of day by allowing the public in. If you're speaking to a developer client, they're going to look more for foot traffic to drive sales, people coming in to eat, that sort of thing. But as someone that likes living in cities, can I walk in? Can I explore? Am I allowed? But I think the programming of it, like that mix of intentional spaces, like some that are more for the tenants, some that are just for beauty, some that have spaces to sit, or the dog park is actually called the Wolf Deck. It's up on the top level of the residential tower, but like having spaces that have a purpose or a multi-purpose are going to be a lot more effective than just a space that is outdoors for the sake of outdoors. I think all of us have been to an office building that has a terrace that is just concrete patio stones and the beating down heat of the sun, right? Like, does it have intention? Is there a place to eat? And then the other big one, both of these developments had a lot of community input and then a lot of community activation. So it's a harder one to measure. It's more of an anecdote to keep in mind for our future practice is, I don't know how many people are Bostonians, and I keep talking about the grocery store, but the grocery store was not in the original plan for that site. There's a group called the Grocery Ladies, their name, not mine, that is a group of families and women for the North End and and Beacon Hill. And there used to be a community grocery store, again, I'm not from Boston, so many years ago in the area that was removed. And they have been advocating for about 20 years for a normal priced grocery store in the area. If you're in the area, there is a Whole Foods, there is like a Roche Brothers, there's some expensive sort of grab and goes, but the Star Market that's located at the hub was a result of their work. But in my opinion, doing post-occupancy research, and no one is going to get me off this soapbox, there's something about a grocery store in a grocery store desert that draws everybody to the site. Like whether it's a commuter that wants to pick up a snack before their train, or somebody walking by that just wants, or even fans. You see fans buying snacks before they go up. I don't know if they're supposed to do that, but I would. But like there's just something about a normal priced grocery store that brings a whole wide spectrum of users to a site. And yes, it's underground. You may not find it at first, but it just makes the space feel more approachable as a member of the community. And now that I'm working with teams on sort of new developments of this scale, I'm like, is it a grocery desert? Could we put in a grocery store? Like there's just as far as a community give back. But when you go back to, and I'm not going to go back too far because I'm looking at the time, but like this sort of categorization of like, what is my neighborhood missing? I think we're really looking forward to the next project on the boards where we can engage with the community members with that time of day diagram and with that, like, what do you think your community needs list? It may not be comprehensive, but can we meet with people that actually live there? And it's like, my neighborhood already has this, this, and this, but if you're going to redevelop this entire site, we could really use this, this, or this. And I think, well, we would say, let's do it because it's the right thing to do. For a developer, they do want people to come to the site and use the site and spend money on the site. But for their tenants, if it's a space that feels more part of the community, it does feel more attractive as well. So it's how do we take these factors that are working really well and sort of bring it to the conversation of the next project. The grocery ladies are great. Apparently they did a lot of protesting at City Hall. And there are still buses, before this grocery store was built, there are buses that went from the north end and Beacon Hill paid for by the city for elderly people in those neighborhoods to get to a low-priced grocery store until this was built. So again, this is, I'd say it's early research. It's mostly anecdotal. We are trying to measure and benchmark a few things, but it's really sort of, now that we've looked at a couple of developments that were deemed pretty successful by the community and some of the factors to consider, this is sort of what we're thinking of bringing into the next ones to help support that initial conversation with users. So again, a bit of a mixed bag in there, but I think it's an interesting story. And if you haven't been to that development around TD Garden, like feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn and tell me what you think. The grocery store there is the largest in the city of Boston. It's also on my way home. So closing thoughts. I have a couple last things about here's where it gets interesting. I did write this a couple days ago before COVID started acting up again. So let's just pretend we're continuing on a downward cycle. I think the interesting parts on our team's mind is that the shift from remote by default. So like you can plan everything pretty good if everybody's always coming in, and you can plan everything pretty good if everybody's remote. What happens in this sort of liminal stage, and a lot of the change management work I'm doing, the conversation always starts at that fear of hybrid by default. Oh no, I have to plan everything hybrid. I need to make sure the cameras are up. I have to find out who's online. I have to have somebody in the room. I have to test the sound, hybrid by default. And then the other part, again, these are my terms, these are not official terms, the possibility of snap hybrid at any moment. So our office has been ramping up attendance for about the last month. And I think the first couple of weeks it started as like, oh, let's do an in-person meeting. And then maybe someone got a bad test or a kid got sick or they had to take care of a puppy. And the meeting had to go from fully planned in person to hybrid on a dime. So maybe you don't get that right away. Maybe you have this delightful workshop where you have attendees that are physically laptops moved from table to table. I'm pretty sure Doug didn't know we had a post-it note on the back of the monitor. We just didn't want to lose track of who was who as we were moving them from table to table. But it's that snap hybrid is the reality of what's currently in. And until the virus has been resolved, it's always going to be there. I think the amount of rapid tests I've taken in the last month or contact tracing methods, and we are writing a lot of standards for hybrid meetings. However, if we can remove the one variable that shall not be named, I think hybrid, and again, this is my opinion based on the last 4 weeks of return to work, I think once you start removing this fear of hybrid by default, you start communicating with each other a little bit more as the cases go down. Maybe you actually advocate for an in-person meeting where you get to use these higher end tools that we didn't have before. So this is actually a meeting I went to 2 weeks ago. It was with a set of user groups where we'd actually met pre-pandemic. We'd tried virtual a couple times and it was just really hard to communicate and sort of understand everything. So we're like, is everybody okay with meeting in person? And it happened, and we didn't have a snap hybrid, but we had a really big screen in the middle of the room. And while we had the paper printout so people could see multiple things at once, we were in Miro taking notes so we could zoom in and the people at the table could actually see better, which I think is something we wouldn't have done in the past. We would have just had the users sort of walk up and look up on their own. But this one, like, we could have gone hybrid in a second. We were taking notes on the screen, we were zoomed in on the screen, but it actually helped us in the room. Like, you're on your laptop taking notes in Miro in person, which was a little weird, but that's a tool that we didn't have before. And then I'd also say there's some meetings that are just going to be virtual with options, like take the call at your desk. Like maybe there's some discussion groups. This top one is, we have a group within the office that plans a weekly wellness call. And we've really found that people are a little more frank when they're their own little box, right? Like they're not editing because they're in a room. So for that particular group talking about wellness every week, we've actually said like virtual is what we're going to stay for now. Anyways, because it puts everybody on a level playing field. We usually do it on Friday mornings. So a lot of people work from home that day, and it just feels better in a virtual zone. So I don't think it's hybrid by default. It'll be a lot of hybrid, but as we start playing with some of the variables, now we have more choices and we have more options of like what works best for the conversation we want to have. Other new tools like Miro, I would love to talk to the UX team at Miro because they're not designing for us. We're using it for a lot of really off prescription uses. But having multiple editors, this is actually an adjacency diagram. So we had the floor plan, but we were able to make different size boxes. How are things connected? And have a design team that was half based in Atlanta, half based in Boston, like actually build this together in live, which is something we probably wouldn't have done before. And then for the client, like as we're having the meeting, as we're moving program pieces around, these are like clumps of adjacencies. Like the connections can be edited live, and that's something that we wouldn't have been able to show like, hey, we're understanding you, we're adjusting the plan in a new tool. If anybody works for the Miro team, please let me know. I need to talk to them about how their lines snap to everything. And then the last one, which I'm genuinely like, I tend to be an optimistic person. We're a global firm. We've got offices all over the globe, but we've also found within time zones, we're connected to other teams in ways that we were not before, whether it's sort of like sharing mentoring and connecting informally. Like, yes, this is for work, but it's connections that wouldn't have occurred to us unless we were already sort of digitally fluent. And we get to keep that. It's not like we throw that away when we come back to the office. We still get to keep these things. So my last sort of soapbox, like, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. I still think that, like, yes, we had our mask mandate back today, but we're still contact tracing. We just put it on. We continue with our lives. But the return to normal, I think, is a phrase that we should definitely stop using. Like, it's going to be different. But there's going to be like different things we can try, and it's still going to be uncertain for the remaining future. And let's move forward with what we learned alongside the change that is going to continue. Like, there's not going to be a direct return to work or we solved it or that sort of thing. It's going to be ongoing sort of learning as we go. I think the last one on this slide, these are all pictures of the hub at different times of day. This is the 8 a.m. one. And my last anecdote before we get to Q&A is I had a client once that was like, oh, the way you measure success of a public space is when the strollers show up. So this was an office building developer, and they wanted to make their lobbies feel more welcoming. They were putting in like public amenities. And she said, yeah, we don't have anybody in here that has strollers, but as soon as you have like a group of moms show up on your site, when it was not designed for moms at all, you know it's a public space. It passed the stroller test. So when I saw the hub passing the stroller test, I was like, yeah, we did it. And then also people taking pictures, which is the other success factor of a wow moment. But yeah, that's a couple minutes over time. But those are all my yarns and anecdotes from the last couple years. Happy to, if you want to shoot me any questions, Joe. I closed the chat tab a while ago. But also, like, I could talk about this for days and days. So you can hit me up on LinkedIn if you're curious for more of the random things we're up to. But I think it's interesting work. I'm glad I am an architect that found that this existed, because detailing windows and walls was not really my jam. Talking to people was more my jam. But yeah, any questions?
All right. Thank you so much, Erin, for the yarns. This is fantastically fun. Yeah, so questions, if people have them, you can type it in the chat, and we'll call on you to ask them.
Okay, looks like a question about sensors. Hopefully there's another half. Or just sensors in general. So the question that popped up in the chat for the benefit of the recording is interest in the use of sensors. Do people have privacy concerns? I would say when we used to talk about sensors pre-pandemic, because it did come up every so often, that was generally the very first question. A lot of the change management we're doing, we usually include a couple slides on sort of what's measured, what's not. The majority or all of the systems that I'm working with, you can't tell exactly who appears at the desk. You just know someone has appeared at the desk, or something has moved by the meeting room. I guess ghosts could trigger it as well. But it's, yeah, so from a privacy perspective, it's more like a motion sensor, like a light turning on or off, as opposed to like, this is Jim, he was at the desk too long, or he didn't show up, or he went to the bathroom too many times. Like, it's anonymized data. But I would say, like, people do want to ask, and when we do communicate out about it, we actually get pretty detailed. Like, we're like, this is the technology, this is how it works. If you want to see what it looks like, this is what it is. But mainly, most of the systems we're using are multi-benefit. They're not just measuring usage, they're also helping with booking and making the experience of sort of selecting your spaces a little easier. How do you coordinate input from lots of sensors, and inputs from sensors really representative, or is it biased by people avoiding them because of privacy concerns? TBD, Peter. We're just starting to put them in en masse. Obviously, like, users are going to be users. Yeah, I have unplugged a sensor in the past. So, like, I've done that because we were testing them in the office, and I'm like, we haven't looked at this data in months. I'm going to unplug this USB. So again, TBD on user behavior around that. I guess if we start seeing reports where like an entire team's sensors are just dark, we might have to do a little more communication, check in with them on their pain points, and talk about the software. But we're not sensor creators. We work with suppliers for it, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Who do you work for? I just want to keep it in mind. I'm joking. Yeah, TBD. Does anybody shop at the Star Market? It's really ridiculously big if you haven't been down there. It scared me the first time I went down. They're like, there's a grocery store there. And then you go down the escalator and it's like 100,000 square foot grocery store.
Okay. I guess I had a question. So thinking back to the Monte Carlo simulation you did of when people are likely to go in, something I noticed when my company like semi opened up again was that like it was very clumpy. Like if people knew other people were going, then they would go. Like, or if there was like a big important meeting where like people would kind of glom on. Have you noticed kind of a glomming on effect?
That's another interesting one. That's why I actually wish our office had sensors so we can see it. We have a COVID contact tracing app, but we can't access the data. So the only data we have is, did someone check in? Like, did they fill out their COVID questionnaire that morning? So we only know how many people came in. I'd say, Joe, anecdotally, I've also noticed it's really clumpy, and very associated with a free lunch. Our office did not provide lunches to employees beforehand. In the return to work couple months, they've been doing relish deliveries, but only on Wednesdays and Thursdays biweekly, and that benefit will eventually fade. But I know a lot of people who are coming in on Wednesday, Thursday during the weeks when there is lunch, because there's free food that would normally only come in one day a week. So you're right, there's a lot of different things tied into it. I think if it weren't for the mask mandate that happened today, we were starting to settle in. At the 4-week mark, you kind of knew it was going to be pretty active on Monday, Tuesday. We're actually sharing desks in our office, so we're over capacity. So all the desks have 2 name tags, and we have some teams that are coming in Monday, Wednesday, and other teams that have an assigned desk Tuesday, Thursday. But you can come in on other days. So for us, it was really clumpy at the start, if somebody had a meeting, but I would say after 3 weeks or so, there were some patterns. It was always busier Monday, Tuesday, quieter later in the week, completely empty on Friday, and it was kind of leveling out as people were figuring out their schedule. So I think it depends, but definitely, especially when you add variables like this, next week, it's probably going to be a lot lower attendance as well, and we'll just see. The Monte Carlo, it's a one-eyed king in the land of the blind, right? We're trying to base it on some good assumptions and sort of run it out as a way to plan. But I would say the sensors are going to help us a lot to, even for the clients that are not putting sensors in, just to know trends and behaviors in similar industries as we go forward. Aditya, I think you've got your hand up.
Yeah, my question was more around designing private spaces in office buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been a shift in strategy? Because in my workplace is hybrid. Some people show up, some don't. And
Mm-hmm.
even for a quick call, people occupy meeting rooms. And then everyone is hunting for empty meeting rooms for any call that necessarily does not need a meeting room. So I was just curious, do you have data or anything in your studies that show there is more need for private space within these office buildings?
Yeah, it's definitely something we're hearing. And it's also when I present this slide, it is oh, there's going to be a lot of people look at it and they're it's going to be so loud. It's so much collaboration. It's going to be so much socializing space. I think the part, and again, I stole this from another deck, but the part that we're adding to this is you still need space to focus. If you come into the office for a whole day, your entire day hopefully won't be collaborating and talking and flitting around. You're going to have to answer some emails. You're going to have to get some work done. So we are finding it's a little hard to see because it's more like a trend. It's sort of proving a point as far as the spaces are shifting. But I would say the one thing that's not really on here is a lot more sort of this scale, 1 to 2, 1 to 3 person meeting rooms that you can sort of grab and go, I think is something that we're putting in a lot more of. But also, I'd say furniture solutions is the other bit. So there's actually a lot of really interesting chairs and tables that have more of a study carrel. It's visual privacy and then a little bit of padding so the sound doesn't carry. And sometimes when you're taking a one-on-one call, that's all you need. And sometimes you need to concentrate for 4 hours and then you really need the closed door, or you're doing a one-on-one or a review or that sort of thing. But I would say the one area that this slide needs is that star of focus is still important. And it is something that's been part of the conversation. Even if you are building a really active space, you've got to zone it so that you also have a quiet car is something we're putting in a lot. But yeah. Does that answer your question ish? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the answer is always it depends. I should just leave it at that. And then encountered identified accessibility needs for disabled folks. Shefali, do you want to specify a little bit? Is it sort of if you share a desk, it might not be the right size or configuration for your disabilities? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. That's exactly what I was thinking of just, are there specific or unique needs that people are voicing in your process that might not have been present pre-pandemic that are coming to light now and being prioritized by some of the clients that you work with?
Mm-hmm. I think to the physical accommodations, we are finding even though I'm talking a lot about shared desks, I would say it's probably only about half of our clients that are going fully unassigned and shared. A lot of our clients are actually doing a mix where like if your role, it's almost coming back to that like resident population. I forget where that was. I'll just cycle back to the end, but like the resident persona that's there more often might actually still have their own desk because they're there every day, right? So to that end, if there is sort of a physical accommodation or whether that's like a special monitor for a visibility issue or that sort of thing, a lot of those conversations in the past, they had like their own designed desk for them. And I would say when it has come up with a few of our clients, it tends to be that mix of like some people are sharing, some people really need their own space. Other things that are coming up a lot as well is sort of designing for neurodivergence. So whether that's people that concentrate better when they have visual privacy or people that need to adjust the light level or dimming, or again, there's a lot of things that fall under neurodivergent, from autism to like ADHD to just personal preference, to be completely honest. So I would say a lot of the spaces that we're designing, the emphasis is really on choice so that you can choose and move to wherever works best for you or the work that you're doing, as opposed to trying to make the desk work for everything. So that tends to be where the conversation is shifting, but I've definitely had more clients in the last year talk about designing for neurodivergence, which tends to be, do you have spaces that are visually quieter versus louder? It's not necessarily that you do it all the way across the office, but you might zone spaces that are a little bit visually less distracting, or with dimmable lights or quieter, or so that people who maybe overreact to stimuli or that sort of thing have options. But it tends to be a little less like designing just one perfect desk and more designing a spectrum of spaces that everybody can use, because I would love to dim the lights at sometimes too. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you. That was super interesting. Thanks for
No worries. It depends on the client too. Some people are a little more aware of that. I would say UX software teams, engineering companies, lab companies, it does tend to come up more often because they do have people that really need to do deep focus. And when they look at some of our plans, they're like, where do I do deep focus? Like I really need to focus on something. So.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks.
And then creating conversations about new tools, I'll elaborate a little bit. It was more of a point, sorry, the question was talking about creating conversations through new tools. I think for us, the main new tool is Miro, I would say. We never used it before the pandemic, but also Zoom, also like being able to connect to people across geographies, having different ways of having conversations than just in person with a bunch of printouts and post-it notes. I think this one in particular, I'd say the two big changes for us is both having digital options, because sometimes maybe you're having a conversation with a user group where it's hard for them to come downtown to talk about a building. You know, doing that on Zoom is now an option we didn't used to have. And then the other, creating new conversations, I think for us going digital and having a number of programs where you can have multiple editors at the same time has really made for some interesting processes for design, especially working across offices, which is something we like. I guess we had video calling before the pandemic, but a lot of our multi-office calls were just that, you know, phone in the middle of the table, bad experience where you can't see the same thing. And now we've got this whole spectrum of different options we can use to support conversations. So we're definitely still paper people. I would say the amount of printing our printers have done in the last 4 weeks has really gone up. But yeah, that's sort of what I meant. And the conversations, I'd say in architecture, the conversations, yes, they are mostly synchronous. We're simple creatures. We do a lot of Teams calls. We talk about asynchronous work a lot, but design, trying to figure out tricky problems, trying to align and bounce off ideas for synthesis, I think we're doing a little bit more asynchronous work than we used to, but I would say we're still predominantly synchronous. We dream of the day when we can actually hand off, and then, but no, we're pretty talky creatures.
All right, any more questions? I guess not. So we will let you go, Erin. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
It was fun. Next time with pizza.
All right. Yeah. We'll have to do that.
Or I guess hybrid. It would be hybrid. You guys have a much wider audience with hybrid too.
Yeah, we do. Yep.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. And see y'all next time.
Cheers.